Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Josh. I'm the Dynasty Buff, and welcome to the channel dedicated to the mastery of Dynasty Fantasy Football. And guys, I am excited for today's episode because we recently did a mock draft with the guys in our Discord for our Dynasty Startup Draft. I'm going to be talking about some Dynasty startup strategies. I'm going to be going through ADP trends and approaches that people took that either worked or didn't work. I'm also going to be pointing out values and reaches that I saw in every single round of our Dynasty Startup mock draft. And because you guys know that I'm an absolute Dynasty addict, we're talking rookies. So whether or not you're preparing for a startup, whether or not you're preparing for your rookie draft, the content will be here. Subscribe to the channel, and enough talking. Let's get it. So before we kick it all off, let's start with some high-level Dynasty strategies, or at least things that you want to be keeping in the back of your mind when you walk into your Dynasty startup draft. And the first thing that you need to focus on is getting cornerstone pieces on your roster, right? Guys that are going to be on your roster for the next 5 to 6 years. You know, I always say play for the next three-year window, but over the course of the first 1 to 3 picks in your Dynasty startup, I'm very risk averse. I'm going in and getting players that are safe. I'm getting players that are young. I'm getting players that will be able to start for me next season and hopefully over the next 3 years as well. So just something to keep in mind, right? In that first 3 to 4 rounds of your draft, you really be creating the identity of your team. Now, the next concept that I really need to push with everybody watching this video is go for best player available. Now, what does that mean, right? There are 2 different things that you need to take into consideration when you are drafting a player in your Dynasty Startup Draft. The first thing you need to take in consideration is what are they going to do next season, right? Are they going to be a running back 1? Are they going to be a running back 2? Is it going to take this player some time to develop? And the second thing you need to take into consideration is what is this player's value going to be in 2 years from now? What is this player's value going to be in the future, right? So if a player's only going to be good next season, and then there's another player who will be good next season and the future, of course, that player will have more value than the other one you're looking at. But you need to keep that in the back of your mind because it's not as simple as, oh, well, you know, maybe he's only an RB2, because you need to consider trade value at that point. You need to go in and realize that if your team is struggling, if you need to rebuild, right, you might have to sell these players. And if they don't have any future value, then you're just going to bankrupt your team before it even starts. So things to keep in mind. And then the third and final high-level tip for your startup draft is get your guys. Go get the players you believe in. Yes, ADP is important, but especially on an app like Sleeper, so you see these Dynasty rankings on Fantasy Pros that are kind of off and on to begin with. Get players you believe in, right? If you believe in a player, if you've been following this guy, maybe they play on your favorite team and you know more than anybody else about them, get those guys. Because I would rather go down on the ship with a player that I love than roll the dice with someone that they're telling me to draft who I don't firmly believe in. So just a couple tips for you guys to kick things off. Now, specifically when I refer to best player available, one of my favorite resources to use is the Fantasy Pros Dynasty rankings, right? And I'm just bringing this up as an example for how I personally see a Dynasty startup draft, right? Because one thing is looking at tiers, right? One thing is realizing that your running backs drop off after the first couple rounds, that quarterbacks are all of a sudden, there's not a lot of starting quarterbacks once you get to a certain part of your draft. But my goal of my startup is to get as much value as possible. You see that numerical value there? That represents each player has one of these. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of these rankings, but I want to walk out of my draft with the most points possible. So things to think about when you go into your draft. Now let's specifically talk about this draft. For reference, I'll pull up my team right now so you guys understand the layout. We start 2 quarterbacks, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and 3 flex spots. Now in my Dynasty leagues, this is my ideal roster because it gives you the appropriate value for quarterbacks. It challenges you to fill up a deep roster, especially in a 12 or 14 team league. And no defenses and kickers. If you guys are still playing with defenses and kickers, stop it. Just if you're in a Dynasty startup right now, stop it. You can't be doing that in Dynasty. It ruins the whole game for me. this is the format that I prefer. And again, guys, I can't emphasize this enough. We did this draft a couple weeks ago. It was before free agency. So some of these picks might be a little outdated, but guys, it was so much fun, man. You got to join the Discord. We'll be doing drafts, mock drafts like this all the time. And we're actually going to be starting up a couple real Dynasty startup drafts here soon. So if you're looking for a league, make sure to join. But all right, man, let's just kick it off. We'll start with the first 2 rounds, and we'll kind of go through an analysis of each round. So the first 2 rounds, rounds 1 and 2, were what I expected them to be. Patrick Mahomes kicks us off at the very beginning of the draft. Now, the guy who had the 2nd overall pick actually took a while to get into the draft board. So it auto-picked Dalvin Cook for him. I'm not sure why that happened, but he was pretty pissed off about it, as I would be as well. So that's the only abnormality, and that was a mistake in the first 2 picks. But we see a quarterback run and then an immediate running back run. And the reality is, as you're looking at this draft board, the running back tier drop-off is steep. If you're trying to get a young workhorse running back, you need to spend a top 2, top 3 pick on him if you're lucky to get that kind of value. Because once you get to that 4th, 5th round and beyond, it's really hit or miss when it comes to running back. So just ADP trend I wanted to point out really quickly. When you look at the quarterbacks of the first round, you'll notice Deshaun Watson's probably going higher than what he was before. This was, of course, before any allegations that he had. I was team number 8. And honestly, the 8th spot was the ideal place to pick for me. This was also before Dak Prescott had that long-term contract. So in hindsight, I would take Dak over Justin Herbert. But the 8th spot, if you get to choose in your dynasty start where you want to be, is perfect because you get to play the ADP game. You don't feel pressure to take one of these high-end guys. You get to get that middle ground of players that you like and get to pay a little bit less for. And my goal throughout, like I mentioned, the first 3 to 4 rounds was to get cornerstone players that I'm going to have on my roster for the foreseeable future, right? And so I start off the draft with Justin Herbert, who I could not ask for a better start right there. I had Justin Herbert and Justin Jefferson, 2 Justins to kick it off, and Justin Jefferson is my wide receiver 1. Right, so to get him, to pair him with Justin Herbert, and then to get Najee Harris in the 3rd, who I'll talk about a little bit down the road. But I really do believe that this core of 3 players will be my quarterback 1, my wide receiver 1, and my RB1 for the next 3 years. And that's what I'm looking for. Getting players that I believe are safe, players that I don't think could bust over the next 3 years, and players that are young and have some legitimate upside to them. So I'm very content with my cornerstone 3 players to kick off the draft. I did want to point out, while we're here talking about the first 2 rounds, we had the first rookie off the board in Trevor Lawrence at the 110. Now, depending on how these other quarterbacks play out, like I've seen Lawrence go as high as the 107, 108 in other startup mocks that we've done. I've seen him go ahead of Lamar Jackson. I've seen him go ahead of Deshaun Watson nowadays. But one thing I really want to point out is that Lawrence went ahead of both Saquon Barkley and Jonathan Taylor. Now, whether or not you agree with that, I'm kind of on the fence. I think they're in a similar tier. Personally, I think I would take Saquon and Jonathan Taylor over Lawrence, but it's really, really close. They're in a very similar tier for me. But I need to point this out because if you're preparing for your rookie draft and you have the 101, this is what his value is, right? If someone comes to you asking for the 101, and even in this example, this person would rather take Lawrence over Saquon straight up. Right, so they wouldn't even take that trade. Jonathan Taylor for Lawrence, they take Lawrence over them straight up. Do I agree with that? Off and on, right? Like I said, but that's what he's being valued at. So that's good to know going into your draft if someone's looking to trade up for Trevor Lawrence. And talking about him specifically, Lawrence was taken at the 110, and Justin Fields, who is my quarterback 2 in this class, was taken at the 3-6. And that's important to point out because in your rookie draft, sometimes it looks like, well, I have the 101, he has the 102. Really, how much would he have to pay me to swap those picks? I'm sure they make that argument to you. Well, I'm only moving up 1 spot. Look at the tier difference between Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields. Now, that does change a little bit if Fields goes to the 49ers with that 3rd overall pick, but man, I'm telling you right now, it's not as simple as just swapping the 101 with the 102. That's almost 2 full rounds in a dynasty startup draft different in value. So keep that in mind because it's not as simple as just swapping picks. So I want to point out for Lauren. The one last thing I did want to point out about the first 2 rounds was there was a real discrepancy over who the wide receiver 1 in Dynasty is, right? Team number 11 here took Tyreek Hill as the wide receiver 1 in Dynasty. Justin Jefferson, like I mentioned, is my Dynasty wide receiver 1. And then you see number 3 here take A.J. Brown, Devontae Adams, and DK Metcalf go after that. So it's tough, right? It's tough because no one really knows who the wide receiver, no one really can firmly make the argument who the Dynasty wide receiver 1 is. And because there is that tier of arguably 3 to 4 players, I'm comfortable with taking any of them. Again, go get your guy here. All right, let's look at rounds 3 and 4 now, moving on from the previous rounds. Like I said, Justin Fields went, Tua went ahead of him. But one thing I do want to point out is that Travis Kelce went at the 3-2, and he went 10 spots ahead of George Kittle. Now, I think, personally, Kittle is my Dynasty tight end 1. Exclusively because of age. I believe Travis Kelce is 32 years old, and I feel like every year we talk about, Kelce, his age is going to catch up with him, and he still keeps producing. But I believe Kittle will be the tight end 1, unless Kyle Pitts comes up and balls out this upcoming season for the foreseeable future. He's so much younger than he is, and I understand the injury risk, but especially if they upgrade at quarterback, I don't think those two should be valued so far apart. Coming into this round in particular, my main concern was just the reality that a Dynasty running back tier was about to aggressively drop off, right? After you get Austin Eckler, right? After you get after Javonte Williams and Joe Mixon in the 5th round, which we'll talk about a little bit down the road, it really, really goes downhill from there. So I'm looking at this and I said, I need my young running back 1, someone who can produce next season, hopefully that over the next couple of years. And for me, that was Najee Harris. If Antonio Gibson was still on the board, it would have been close, but I still would have leaned Harris. And guys, I am such a Najee Harris fan, man. The guy is 6'2", 230 pounds, one of the most entertaining people to listen to. You have to go listen to Adam Schefter's podcast with Najee because it's just hysterical. He's just such a class act. Anyways, big fan of his for a number of reasons. One, he's very big and strong, right? 6'2", 230. That's no joke, right? He'll run you over. But he also has such shiftiness and great footwork for a running back of his size. So not only will he run you over, but he'll also break your ankles. He's got this stutter step that is just so impressive. On top of all that, he doesn't have that high-end speed, which, people will knock him for. He's not going to necessarily run for an 80-yard touchdown unless that's something he's really developed over the past year. But his hands are insane, man. He put up numbers at receiving numbers at Alabama that some wide receivers can't really do, right? So if a team uses him that way, if he lands with the Steelers, with the Jets, with the Falcons, or even with the Dolphins, I do think he'll be a full-on workhorse running back 1. And so I'm very excited to get him there. And if he does land with the Steelers or the Falcons, I do think he'll be taken more in this Cam Akers area, right? In the mid to 2nd round. So getting him in the late 3rd round was a great value from my perspective. But you realize once you take that running back, you are sacrificing it at other positions, right? I showed you guys the roster. We start 2 wide receivers and 3 flex spots. So having a lot of value, depth is important here. And I had to pass up on players that I love, like Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley, all went before my next pick, and I love all of those players. And so this was a moment where I had to look at the rankings, I had to look at my own personal rankings and say, okay, I'm going best player available, and I need to understand there's a tier drop. And you need to do that throughout your draft. You're sitting here on the clock, said, okay, man, this is the best player available, but by the time my next pick comes around, there might not be another running back on the board, so I need to reach a little bit. I don't think Najee was a reach here, but that's a good philosophy that you need to have going into your draft. I got Jalen Hurts here in the 4th round, and honestly, this kind of felt like a steal, man. I know the Dynasty community is pretty split on who Jalen Hurts is and what his value is in Dynasty. But I mean, we saw him without training with the starters for the Eagles, without having any real experience, just being thrown in off a COVID offseason onto this roster, become the starter, right? And perform for fantasy because of his rushing value. Now, when it comes to his passing, it's off and on. So I don't know if he's the long-term answer for the Eagles, but getting him in the 4th as my QB2, I was ecstatic for. I was very, very excited to get him there. I think he's a huge value in this range because if you look at the rest of the quarterbacks taken after him, he is this high. I don't think anyone taken after him, Matthew Stafford, Ryan Tannehill, Aaron Rodgers, Baker Mayfield, Carson Wentz, maybe Trey Lance. I'm probably not Zach Wilson, right? But none of those guys have the upside to be a top 3 dynasty quarterback. I don't see it happening, right? Maybe Trey Lance. but Justin Fields has the rushing ability and now the opportunity to potentially be there. So to get him as my quarterback too felt like a steal. I felt like having him drop to the mid-4th was great value as well, where he has that upside, but I didn't feel like I needed to reach on him. So that was a pick I was very excited for. Another thing I want to point out about this specific round, the 4th round in particular, Jamar Chase went off the board right after Calvin Ridley and right ahead of Chris Godwin. Now, gun to my head, if I had to choose right now between Jamar Chase and Chris Godwin, it's close. Right, I understand that choice. Honestly, I would probably lean Jamar Chase. I love him as a prospect, and I think he's going to get the draft capital and eventually the volume that Chris Godwin probably won't see with the Buccaneers this upcoming season, and who knows who is his quarterback down the road as well. Also wanted to point out that Michael Thomas really fell, guys. I did a Dynasty startup last offseason, and Michael Thomas was the 103 in the Dynasty startup draft, and now look at him. He's the 412, right? I think that's a little bit of an undervalue, right? I mean, he's still only 28 years old, right? He's in that range. So he's not super old, right? He's not incredibly young either, but he has that long contract. And I understand we don't know who his quarterback is, but I'm just saying, so I wouldn't necessarily reach on him any higher than the 412. You can get him in the mid-4th round. Great value. All I'm pointing out right now is that Michael Thomas is kind of this post-hype sleeper. Even though he did live up to the hype 2 years ago. I don't know what it's going to look like without Breeze, but just the talent and that money that they have behind him, especially if Jameis Winston ends up being the quarterback, Michael Thomas could end up being a huge value here at the 412. All right, moving on to the 5th and 6th round. As you can see, my team here at the 8th overall pick, I went David Montgomery. And this was another situation where I was looking at best player available, right, which in my opinion was either Allen Robinson or Amari Cooper, and realizing after David Montgomery, there really are no other running backs that I really wanted as for my running back too. I could have waited a little bit, maybe gotten a Kareem Hunt on the other end because I was really interested in taking Robinson or Cooper, but I don't think Montgomery will be the RB4 overall in fantasy next season like he was last season. I don't think he'll be as good as the end of the season numbers look, but I still think he'll be a mid to high end RB2 next season. He's still only 23 years old. He still is the bell cow in that mediocre offense, right? So I think he's a safe running back too, and he's still young. So I'll take that. I really need to point out the wide receivers that started off the 6th round, right? In my opinion, Allen Robinson, Amari Cooper, and Keenan Allen all will be wide receiver 1s in 2021 and 2022. They'll all be, in my opinion, top 12 wide receivers for the next 2 seasons. Top 12. I believe in the talent. They're all 28 years old or 27. They're in that range where they're not that old yet, where I'm concerned of their age. And you're getting these discounted veteran wide receivers at such a cheap price that will perform on your roster, right? Getting Allen Robinson, Amari Cooper, or Keenan Allen in the 6th is a steal, right? And I'll mention this multiple times throughout this video, but if you go quarterback and running back early, there are so many good wide receivers that will perform later in the draft. So getting Keenan Allen at the 6'5", to pair him with Justin Herbert, getting that stack, I'm thrilled about. I also would like to point out from this round that Kyle Pitts was taken here at the 5'11" over that run of wide receivers. Now, that might be a little rich for me, right? And this draft was done a couple weeks ago, so this was before Kyle Pitts' pro day. And honestly, people were kind of freaking out. They thought it was a huge reach on Pitts. Nowadays, that's probably understandable considering, Darren Waller went a full round before him. But Kyle Pitts has the talent to be the tight end 1. We don't know his landing spot yet. And once we see that, it will solidify that a little bit more. But yeah, just wanted to point that out to show you guys where he's going right now in Dynasty startups. And honestly, after the NFL draft, he's probably going even higher. I'd also like to highlight that both Javonte Williams and Kenneth Gainwell went in these 2 rounds, and I think that's realistic. I do think that Javonte Williams, if he lands in a spot where he'll be a workhorse, I think his ADP will rise quite a bit. Talking really quickly about some values that I like in these 2 rounds, it's got to be Joe Mixon and Terry McLaurin, right? I do think Terry McLaurin, the way I have him ranked, he's a top 12 Dynasty wide receiver. I don't know what wide receiver he is currently off the board. He's probably in that range, but I believe in that talent that much. And with Fitzmagic under center, I think he's about to explode going into next season. And then Joe Mixon, I do think Joe Mixon's only 24 years old, and I like Joe Mixon a lot. He's just burned me so many times in redraft over and over and over again that it's hard for me to go back, right? I feel like every single time I say Joe Mixon's going to blow up, he blows up in a bad way and wrecks my team. But in the 5th round, you're getting a legit potential in my opinion, he's a low-end RB1 in redraft next season, and I think he even has value going into 2022 as well. So in the 5th round, you're getting a borderline running back 1. And that's value, right? That's value right there. So just two things I want to highlight. If you're in your 5th round, players I'd want to keep an eye out on as well. I do want to highlight that our draft was done before Aaron Jones signed that big contract with Green Bay. So Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon being taken for the same team in the 4th and 5th round probably won't happen in your dynasty startup. I wouldn't recommend that either. Moving on, we're going to talk about rounds 7, 8, and 9. And as you guys can see here, rounds 8 and 9 are the reason why I highly recommend that you go running back and quarterback early and then stack up on these young or veteran wide receivers later in your draft to fill out the rest of your board, right? In rounds 8 and 9, of the 24 picks of those 2 rounds, 16 of those picks were legit wide receivers. Right? I like almost every single wide receiver in this range, and that's exactly what I did when you look for my team. Right in round 7, I did go Jalen Waddle here. In hindsight, now that I've done a little bit more research, done a little bit more done a little bit more scouting on these upcoming rookies, I 100% would have taken Rashad Bateman over Jalen Waddle. Rashad Bateman is my wide receiver 2 in this class. He's actually my 2A. Devonta Smith is my 2B in this class. So I have Jamar Chase in his own tier. Then I have Rashad Bateman and Devonta Smith in that 2nd tier. Now, I do think that Smith will be drafted in the NFL draft a lot higher than Bateman will, so maybe that will give him a little bit more of an automatic role on the roster. But when it comes to sheer prospects and sheer talent, that's where I have them. Then I have Waddle in a tier after that. So if I could go back, I would definitely take Bateman over Waddle because he is my wide receiver 2 in this class. A couple of guys that I do want to point out. I do think that Chase Claypool was slightly a reach here. Guys, I'm not the biggest Chase Claypool fan. That's just me. I know he was kind of off and on in fantasy last season. I'm not sure what the future of the quarterback position looks like for Pittsburgh. And really last season, he had a mediocre season, and that the hype was really carried by him scoring 4 touchdowns that one game. Outside of that, it was kind of off and on. So it was a little bit of a reach considering who else was on the board, right? Considering players like Jerry Jeudy, who I think is a huge buy low right now in Dynasty, Rashad Bateman, Kenny Golladay, DJ Chark, Deontay Johnson, Juju, Cortland Sutton, Tyler Boyd even I'd probably consider maybe not over Claypool, but in that same tier. So I thought it was a slight reach there. And I know I've already said this. Go running back early. Because look at this. That's exactly what I did. I got the core of my running back class. I got the core of my quarterback class. And then all these wide receivers were just sitting there. And I love how my roster was looking after round 6 through 9 because I have Justin Jefferson as my wide receiver 1, Keenan Allen as my wide receiver 2, Jalen Waddle, who should have been Rashad Bateman if I could go back and switch that around, DJ Chark, who I think has legit wide receiver 1 upside with Trevor Lawrence coming to town. And then Robert Woods, who with Matthew Stafford under center, again, Woods is only 1 year older than Cooper Kupp is, but people are leaving him for dead. Getting him in the 9th round was a huge steal, in my opinion. Another trend I'd like to point out from round 7 through 9 is that you see the quarterbacks really fall off here, right? At the beginning, even up to Carson Wentz and Kirk Cousins, for example, they still, I believe, are locked in as starters for the next 2 years. You look at every single quarterback after that, and you don't know if this quarterback will be a starter in 2022, right? Jared Goff, Daniel Jones, Tom Brady, Jameis Winston, Derek Carr, Matt Ryan, all of these quarterbacks that I mentioned in that round 7 through 9, we don't know what their future holds. They'll be a starter, most likely in 2021, but past that, we are not sure. So that's something to keep in mind. If you go in and you get a quarterback early, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to wait till the later rounds to get quarterback, it's fine, right? That's absolutely fine. But you just have to realize that whatever quarterback you're going to be drafting in this range might not be starting in 2022. So keep that in mind. Values that I absolutely loved in this range from that 7, 8, and 9 round was, of course, I already mentioned Robert Woods. Felt like an absolute steal here. I really like the Kenny Golladay, DJ Chark, and Deontay Johnson run here. I think all 3 of those players are, in my opinion, top 24 dynasty wide receivers that you got much later than that here in the draft. Another player I love in this range is Noah Fant. I think Noah Fant has all the physical attributes to blow up next season. So we'll see who that quarterback is, but he's another guy that I'm excited to watch next season. And if Jamar Chase doesn't go to the Bengals, give me Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd is the wide receiver 2 that nobody wants. He was really, really good in fantasy last season with Joe Burrow under center. So if Jamar Chase doesn't show up taking away targets, Tyler Boyd is another quote-unquote veteran who's still in his mid-20s who will be a solid weekly wide receiver 2 high-end wide receiver too some weeks that you can get in the 9th round. Julio Jones was also taken in this round, which I thought was important to point out, just in the sense that he's another one of those guys that I'm not really interested very much in Dynasty. I get that he's a perennial wide receiver 1. I understand that. And he might be that for next season as well if you really are focused on that win now mode. But for me, it really is so important to think about the future as well. Right? What is this player going to do next season, and what will I be able to trade him for after that? I want players that have room to ascend, and I don't think Julio Jones is that guy. Right? I'm not even sure if he barely made it through last season with all the injuries he struggled with. I'm almost positive next season will be his last fantasy viable season. I don't know if he retires after that, but his stock has just continued to go down. So it's not like you drafted him early in the 7th, but to draft him over guys like Kenny Golladay, DJ Chark, and Deontay Johnson, players who probably might not outproduce him, but be in a similar tier in 2021, but will definitely have value past that. I would not take Julio that high. And then a couple guys I wanted to point out as well include Rondale Moore and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Terrace Marshall. We're all taken here. And for this moment, I mean, this guy needs all those wide receivers to hit for his team to have value, because he did reach a little bit on these guys over other players. And again, landing spot will determine that. But I love Rondale Moore. I think he's going to be a PPR beast. Amon-Ra St. Brown is being called the best route runner of this entire draft class. And Terrace Marshall is just a beast, right? We know his upside. Dynasty Twitter loves Terrace Marshall. So it's kind of a risky strategy. This is where those rookies are being taken right now. The biggest reach for me in this round was Darnell Mooney. Right, I love Darnell Mooney. I'm a big fan of his. In one of our buy low episodes, I was telling everybody to stash him on their roster, but to have him here in the 9th round and to take him over players like Robert Woods, Will Fuller, Odell Beckham Jr., even Jalen Reagor felt like a reach, right? Because I understand the upside. I like his talent, but a lot of that upside hinges on the quarterback play, which I'm not super excited about Andy Dalton. And a lot of my arguments came from if Allen Robinson left. Right, I was hoping that he'd see an influx of targets at that point, and Allen Robinson isn't around for another year. So if he were to be taken a round later, I'd be fine with that. But where he was taking over a guy like Robert Woods, who is a legit top 24 dynasty wide receiver in my opinion, that would just seem like a stretch. Rounds 10 and 11 were all about flex play depth at this point. As you guys saw, you need to start 3 flex players in this specific format. And some of the better values here are OBJ, right? Jalen Reagor, Marquise Hollywood Brown, and Deebo Samuel. I really think all 3 of those players, we could be looking back on this in a year from now and be like, wow, that was a great value. They all blew up next season. Of course, there's risk, right? OBJ can't stay healthy, right? Jalen Reagor struggled with injuries, and we don't know what he's going to look like if they add another wide receiver to that roster. And, Hollywood Brown, it's hard to catch. It's hard to catch your 5 targets a game when it's coming from Lamar Jackson. So I understand the hesitation, but all those guys were great value picks in this range. My favorite pick in the 10th round, though, was Dallas Goedert. Right, we've talked about this. Kyle Pitts is not falling to the Eagles anymore because they traded back. And Dallas Goedert is my favorite tight end to buy right now. I think he's about to have a breakout season between their new offensive coordinator or their new head coach coming in, leaving from the Indianapolis Colts who heavily rely on the tight end position, Dallas Goedert's natural ability, and now the vacancy of targets, because I don't believe Ertz will be on that roster next season. Dallas Goedert could blow up in 2021 as soon as next season. And if that happens, I really do think that Dallas Goedert, who I got in the 10th round, could be regarded in a similar range to TJ Hawkinson, who was taken in the 7th. This draft was also done before the Sam Darnold trade, and I'm still excited about the value I got with Sam Darnold. I have my quarterback 1 as Herbert, quarterback 2 Hurts, and then to have that safe pick in Darnold, I do think he will be the starter for the Carolina Panthers. I do think now that he's not under Adam Gase, he has legit opportunity and a potential future in the NFL now. I'm excited to get him on my roster. He's the ideal QB3 that you can get later in the draft. Don't forget, this man is still younger than Joe Burrow. To finish it up, we're going to talk about rounds 12 through 15. In a typical Dynasty startup draft, you're going to have much later rounds than that. It probably goes to round 25 to 30. Before this exercise, we just went to round 15. And I was sitting here, and guys, once you get to this point, once you get this late in the draft, forget ADP. I no longer care what Sleeper says. I no longer care what Fantasy Pros Dynasty rankings say. Get your guys, right? Get guys that you need on your roster. I was sitting here in the 12th round, realizing that Najee Harris and David Montgomery are my only running backs, and I was getting a little nervous about that. So I grabbed Chase Edmonds here. who I think is just a perennial flex play at the running back position, especially if they really do only stick with James Conner. I think they're going to split that backfield. And then Tony Pollard is another guy who, if Zeke, I mean, he didn't look good at the end of last season. Even though I think Zeke's a buy, it's always possible that Zeke just does not bounce back and Tony Pollard takes that, or Zeke gets injured and Tony Pollard's a running back 1. So to get him in the 13th round was I was excited about it. One of my favorite guys to get in the 14th, 15th round is Paris Campbell, because I actually tend to like Carson Wentz a little bit. I think he's going to do pretty well. I think he's a better passer than Phillip Rivers. Maybe that's a hot take. But with that, reuniting with Frank Reich, getting that offensive line in front of him, having Jonathan Taylor to take pressure off of him from the defense. If Paris Campbell comes back healthy, the man is a former second-round pick, and he balled out at Ohio State. He is so incredibly fast. Coming out of the slot, if he's healthy, this could be one of the better value picks of the draft. And to wrap it up, one of my favorite tight ends to buy. I already talked about Dallas Goedert, but if I can get Tyler Higbee in the 15th round, robbery. That's theft, getting him this late. Remember, he was the tight end 1 at the end of 2019 when Everett wasn't there. Everett comes back. He doesn't have that great of a season. Now that Gerald Everett is completely gone from this roster and Matthew Stafford is under center, I think Tyler Higbee might not be the tight end 1. He might not average 20 points a game like he did at the end of 2019, but he will still be good. I still think he's going to have a breakout season. I got him in the 15th round. Rounds 11 through 15 are why I'm not necessarily sold on getting a Travis Kelce or a Kittle at the very beginning of the draft, right? I'd rather, in my personal strategy, I'd rather get a running back and then get a couple of these late round flyer tight ends, right? Hunter Henry, okay, maybe not at least with the Patriots, but Mike Gesicki, Cole Kmet, let's see, Robert Tonyan, Jonnu Smith, Hayden Hurst, Irv Smith, Logan Thomas, Tyler Higbee, then of course Dallas Goedert, and I'm a big fan of Pat Freiermuth as well coming into the NFL. All these players you can get late. If I can start my dynasty startup with that running back and quarterback stacks that we were talking about, and then come at the end and get a couple of these flyers, right? If I can walk out with this combination of Dallas Goedert and Tyler Higbee later, then I would much rather do that than invest early in a Kittle or in a Kelce. But that's just my personal strategy. The biggest value picks here at the end of the draft, in my opinion, Mecole Hardman, I think he could have a good year next season if the Chiefs don't add anyone else to that roster. I still think he's going to be boom bust, but I think he could have a good season as a boom bust wide receiver 3. Another guy I'm really excited for is Bryan Edwards, another wide receiver I was high on coming into the NFL, has opportunity to see some legit targets in that Raiders offense, and was injured all last season. No one's talking about him, but he's in the 14th round coming into his sophomore season. Now that he's fully healthy, I think he has a legit chance of balling out next year. And I know these are players that people aren't excited for, but if you're starting 3 flex spots like we talked about, Corey Davis, Robbie Anderson, and Brandon Cooks are great late veteran fillers, right? Corey Davis is gonna see targets with the Jets. Robbie Anderson was actually decently impressive last season, and Brandon Cooks the same way. I mean, if Watson isn't a Texan, then his value is definitely shaky. I'm not as excited for Cooks considering his injury history and considering Tyrod Taylor's probably under center. But if Watson is somehow still with the Texans, that could be another guy who's a solid flex play, right? These are players you need on a week-by-week basis to fill out that roster. All right, now let's look at specific rosters and what people did, diving into their dynasty startup strategy a little bit. And we have to start with team number 1 here because they really did go with their version of the 0 running back strategy. So I'll pull up their team here. Looking at his team at first glance, pretty impressive, right? Anytime you have Patrick Mahomes to start off a roster, it looks good. Jared Goff, and then his backup quarterback is Matt Ryan. It's not bad, so it's all right. I do unfortunately think both of those quarterbacks are in a situation where they might not be starters past 2022, so that's something he's going to have to either trade for or draft in these upcoming drafts. In this version of the 0 running back strategy, he started with Devontae Adams, DK Metcalf, and Michael Thomas, and I love that core. Those 3 wide receivers will give him such a solid foundation on a year-by-year basis, and those 3 will be good in fantasy for the next 4 to 5 years potentially. So I really like the safety that comes with those 3. But when you start your draft off that way and you pass up some of those running backs that he passed up on, right? He passed up on both Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Josh Jacobs, Antonio Gibson, Najee Harris, Miles Sanders. When you pass up on those players, it forces you to make moves in the draft that aren't ideal, where you're not going best player available, where you're almost pigeonholed into making a specific decision, right? Like he starts off quarterback, 3 wide receiver. Fantastic. His roster looks great. I like Javonte Williams. I like Chris Carson for 2021. I don't think he'll have much value past that. Then he did a good job getting backup quarterbacks, and Cooper Kupp's great value in the 9th. But the rest of his draft had to be running back. Because if Javonte Williams does not pan out, if Chris Carson isn't fantasy valuable after next season, he's going to be forced to start these backup flex RB3s, RB4s that I'm not interested in, right? I don't want Damian Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, Rashad Penny, Jamal Williams, or JD McKissic really on very many of my rosters, because what upside do they provide? Right? These last rounds are supposed to be getting those rookie wide receivers that could blow up and could change your roster. But when you're forced to take running backs, it really just cuts your whole team off at the knees. That's why I don't go 0 running back. I like those first 4 picks are tough to argue with. But when you look at his team and his depth as a whole, right, if Michael Thomas were to get hurt, right, or they're in bye weeks, all of a sudden you're starting flex players like Damian Harris, Rashad Penny, and Jamal Williams in your flex, and you're going to have a hard time beating anyone with that team. This next team I would like to talk about has the closest thing that I can offer as a perfect dynasty startup formula. All right, if I were to break down the science, do all the math, and give you a formula of this is what you should be shooting for due to ADP in your dynasty startup, this is what I would go for. And that's team number 4 here, Alex's team, where he started off with 2 quarterbacks, then he went 2 running backs, and then just stacked up on young wide receivers, getting the values that he liked out of that wide receiver. And it's tough to, and then finishing up with tight end. Again, this was before the Patriots grabbed Hunter Henry. So if that were to be swapped around, he probably would have grabbed another tight end. But it's not perfect, right? Because you're not necessarily getting best player available. And I don't like going into a draft saying this is what I'm going to do per round, because I like to see what players will fall. But if I were to give you guys a formula, this is what it would be. Get your quarterbacks, get those young running backs, and then just stack up at young wide receivers. Because I think all of these guys, I mean, I love Terry McLaurin. I just talked about it. All of these guys have legitimate upside, and his team will be good now, and it has the upside to be good down the road as well. And then wrap up the draft and get your guys, right? I like the Taysom Hill pick at the very end there. If Taysom Hill ends up being the starter for some reason, he could be good in fantasy next year. So if I were to give you guys a standard formula, that's what I would recommend. But that all being said, I highly recommend going best player available and letting the draft come to you, not coming with a strict formula. Now let's go to my personal draft strategy, where you go best player available while looking at tier drop-offs, right? I've already talked about this with you guys ad nauseum. But Justin Herbert, Justin Jefferson, and Najee Harris were my top guys, right? And then once I started seeing tier drop-offs happen, right? Jalen Hurts, I felt like I needed to grab him there because I felt a huge tier drop-off was about to happen. David Montgomery, he was the best player available before a tier drop-off. So I knew I needed to pick him over the wide receivers I probably would have preferred, but I needed to grab him before then. Same here, right? You just have to follow ADP trends, get the players who are going to get you the most points here on this dynasty trade value chart. And if you're able to do that, then your team's not only going to be good for next season, but hopefully down the road as well, because there'll be so much value and potential trade assets on your team. And the last strategy I want to talk about is Team Chinoa here with the 11th overall pick. It's very rare you see a 0 quarterback strategy in a 2 quarterback league or super flex league. So we'll pull up his team now, see how it turned out. So he did end up with Carson Wentz and Jameis Winston. And again, these are players that if you're going to wait on quarterback, those are great value picks later on that could be legit starters as soon as next season. And he did sacrifice, of course, quarterback early, but then you get Saquon Barkley and Travis Etienne as your running backs 1 and 2. You get Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb, who are 2 dynasty wide receiver ones, in my opinion. You get Kyle Pitts, who is already being ranked as a top 5, if not top 3 dynasty wide tight end by some. And then, I mean, he took his guys. I think Pittman in hindsight went a little bit higher maybe than I would have, but I know he's a Pittman truther. He got his guys. So I know he sacrificed on quarterback, and so he's kind of risky there going down the road. But the fact of the matter is his core at running back and wide receiver is so elite. He was able to get value at quarterback later in the draft that I think it's going to work out just fine for him. All right, guys, that is the Dynasty Mock Startup Draft that we ran a couple of weeks ago. I hope you guys took value from this. If you did, please go ahead and like that button and subscribe to this channel, because I'll be trying to grind out similar content for the rest of the offseason and guiding you through that season as well. What do you guys think of my team? What strategy you go? Do you go no running back? Do you go no quarterback? Do you go quarterback super early? Let me know in the comments below, and let me know who you thought was the best value in this entire draft. All right, guys, I appreciate you all, and we'll see you next time. Peace.